Welcome to Understanding Cancer. Today we're visiting with Dr. Skip Burris, who is the Director of Drug Development at the Sarah Cannon Research Institute in Nashville, Tennessee. Dr. Burris has extensive experience in new drug development as well as clinical trials in general with a focus on oncology. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like to start our discussion today, which is going to focus on clinical trials, by expressing sort of a common concern that patients have when they hear the term clinical trials. I think it tends to evoke a little fear. They don't want to be experimented on. They don't want to be a guinea pig. So when a patient comes in and talks to you, how do you explain what a clinical trial is in your initial discussions?
And I think that's an excellent point. I think you've got to take the fear factor away from clinical trials. So we look at several different aspects to it. And one is that the field of oncology, the practice of cancer care, has progressed to the point that now participating in a clinical trial is really standard of care plus. So you're going to get whatever your doctor thinks is the best treatment for you, and then you're going to possibly get something additional that might improve your outcome or might improve how well you tolerate the treatment. The second part of it is really the understanding the scrutiny under which the trials go. So really quite a lot of look-sees by institutional review boards and by oversight panels, and a lot of thought that goes into designing a clinical trial. And really the last part about a clinical trial that I think is important is to know that there's a lot of time, energy, and money invested in these. So in fact, there's a lot of motivation to only bring forth a trial that's got promise to it. So there's a lot of motivational factors for all parties involved. The other part about a clinical trial that I think is important for patients to understand is it gives you an extra set of eyes. It's that research nurse, the other components of the research staff that help look over your care. So actually you end up getting the standard treatment personnel that are helping with your care, plus a little bit more in that direction as well.
So in essence, for patients that participate in clinical trials, they could actually be getting more oversight and more care than if they were seeing their regular doctor.
Exactly, and I think that's the hard part. Some doctors struggle explaining because it's that feeling that we provide good care already, so what extra could be given? But the fact of the matter remains that having an extra set of eyes, having somebody else double checking on your test results, somebody else questioning you about side effects or some of the symptoms you might be experiencing only adds to your overall benefit from participating. And I think in general it's been shown to improve the care of the patient. It's interesting, the NCCN guidelines, so NCCN standing for the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, is a group of cancer centers that publishes parameters, guidelines for what are suggested treatment recommendations for patients with a variety of cancers. And on every page in their documentation, they state that the best care for a cancer patient should be consideration for participation in a clinical trial. And I think that's an important thing that we try to practice by in our motto at Sarah Cannon Research Institute, is always consider a clinical trial. It's often the best alternative for a patient.
You mentioned the Institutional Review Board as one safeguard for patients that are participating in trials. Are there any other safeguards? I mean, how does a patient know that a trial has been designed with their safety interests in mind?
So that's a key thing for a patient to think through. They should be presented with a consent form. So this should be a several-page document that's really written in very straightforward language. Really try to keep it at a high school education level or below, where it explains the clinical study, what sort of tests you'll be undergoing, what sort of visits you'll be expected to make to the clinic, and then get into some of the details about what side effects you might experience. So that document should in fact clearly state that the protocol's been reviewed and that the protocol's been approved by an institutional review board. And on that paperwork, you should actually be signing that you've read the document, and there should be a witness to your signature. You should also have contact information in that form. So you should be seeing in there that you've got a phone number to call if you've got a question or concern. In addition to the Institutional Review Board, the other part that should come out in that consent form is the fact that the trial's been reviewed and that there are, if any findings come out about the study or new treatment options become available, that should be made clear to the patient. When we put a study through the process, also most studies, in fact, will require the FDA to render either a number of oversights on an investigational new drug, for example, if a new therapy is being studied, or to exempt it if we know that there's sufficient information about that investigational new drug.
I always think of oncology as being essentially developmental in nature. In other words, even when we have a standard of care, there's still room for improvement. And hence, I'm guessing that's the recommendation that the NCCN makes why patients should consider a clinical trial. Do you think that all patients should actually have a discussion with your doctor about whether a clinical trial is right for them?
I think so. You bring up a good point about where we are in oncology or cancer care, and it's really in its infancy. We're 50 years out from the very first chemotherapy drugs being delivered. That's the nitrogen mustard and some of the compounds post-World War II. But in fact of matter, really cancer care has been a product of the late 70s, early 80s. So we're very early in understanding how to treat these cancers. There's probably rare malignancies, Hodgkin's disease, testicular cancer, where we have very high cure rates. But I would say outside of those two specific examples, a patient should ask about clinical trials. I think it challenges the physician to really think about what might be best available for the patient. And often it brings up the idea of a second opinion, somebody else taking a look at your case and considering what the most appropriate treatment alternatives might be.
And for the average patient, where are clinical trials typically going to be available?
So clinical trials are becoming more and more available in the community setting. And what I mean by that is we traditionally think about universities or academic medical centers providing clinical trials. But now the pharmaceutical companies, the research groups all understand that patients' care is often best provided in their own community. Seeing that medical oncologist or seeing the radiation oncologist who made their diagnosis and has started their initial treatment planning for them. So more and more of these clinical trials are set up in such a way that the patients can receive those therapies close to home. That's been a model of the Sarah Cancer Research Institute to in fact have our clinical trials out there available in these communities. And I think the doctor that the patient's seeing is more than likely has access to a clinical trial or knows of a clinical trial that the patient can participate in. There's also been a growing impetus by the National Cancer Institute to provide through a internet mechanism for doctors to be able to look up on the website what clinical trials are available, and actually very easy for some doctors to participate in clinical trials on a one-off basis, participating in that particular study.
It seems whether it's the federal government funding the cooperative groups, major universities doing outreach, or organizations such as your own building networks within the community in general, that trials are increasingly more available and part of the overall care plan for patients.
Yes, I think that it's disappointing when you look at the number of patients that go on trial. We consider ourselves to do very well in terms of accrual to studies, and even at our center, we're probably at 7 or 8% of patients, not even reaching the 10% parameter. Unfortunately, across the country, the number is still less than 5% of patients that participate. And we've talked earlier about the advantages of participating in a study, but really moving the whole science forward and really getting some of these new therapies available for all patients. These clinical trials need to get conducted.
So in my lifetime in oncology, the number of patients that participate in trials, despite a lot of effort by the government and other organizations, hasn't really increased that much. What do you think the major barriers are as to why patients don't participate in a clinical trial more often?
It's interesting that when you look at, in our practice, why patients don't participate, we still have a large number of patients that the trials never offer to them. The physician's busy, or the treatment course seems to be predetermined, that it seems to be a very straightforward approach. And sometimes it takes an extra few minutes to make that decision, to look things up. The patient might seem uncomfortable with that diagnosis. Being told you have cancer is a scary proposition of itself. So to stop at that point and really think about participating in a trial often gets overlooked, and it just simply doesn't happen. The other problem is having a clinical trial for your particular scenario of cancer, your stage of cancer, or your type of cancer. So I think having a well-rounded menu, we actually try to have a clinical trial menu out there for our physicians so that more likely than not, there is a trial available for that patient.
Is cost a barrier?
Cost is a barrier. I think it shouldn't be. I think it's perception of cost that's a barrier. I think many patients are concerned about their insurance companies and about paying for clinical trials. I think that's something that within the study budgets, it's something outside standard of care that in fact the pharmaceutical companies are going to be paying, or the research funds provided to pay for those costs. The other part is, in fact, many insurance companies, and certainly Medicare leading the way as a government insurance agency, actually advocates participating in a clinical trial. So taking time to think through that, see what those costs really are, it can often be cheaper for a patient to participate in a clinical trial and have some of their therapies or some of their tests provided.
But to sort through that and those and other issues, you really have to be seen in a clinic that at least has an interest in wanting to offer patients clinical trials.
Yes, and I think, disappointingly so, there is still not a sufficient number of medical oncologists out there that are interested in clinical trials. It can slow down the day. It can require an extra visit by a patient, but I really think that time and that extra visit's all worthwhile. I talk to patients about, cancer treatment decisions being urgent, not emergent. There's often very little that has to be done that day. And in fact, waiting a few days or a week or two to get the right treatment is better than getting the treatment that afternoon or the next day. So I think a word of caution about taking a step back, really looking at treatment alternatives, because really once you start the process of that treatment, you don't want to change. So you're on a treatment course that's going to go for many months, and prior to taking that first treatment, really think about what your alternatives are.
So clinical trials are something that patients really need to think about as part of their initial treatment planning.
They should. I think it's always worth asking. New treatments come along every day. Drugs move quickly along the development pathway, so they move from very investigational trials to later stage studies where they're being compared with standard of care. So really the advances in cancer treatment are moving so quickly that it's hard for anybody to keep up, any one medical oncologist or any one institution. That's where the internet can be very helpful for patients that have access to that, or really speaking to the nurses or the staff in the clinic to ask those questions and to seek out some guidance in that direction is very, very useful.
I know that when I see a new cancer patient or talk to someone that's seeking a referral, I typically recommend they get a second opinion, usually at some place where they have a dedicated interest in their situation. So if they have colon cancer, I typically send them to someone that is fundamentally interested in doing colon cancer research.
And I think that's useful. I think, a second opinion is nothing for a doctor or a patient to be concerned about. I think it's something that we all should advocate more strongly. Getting a second look at the case sometimes brings out some new features that one hasn't thought about. And the fact of the matter is, in most times, in most situations, the two physicians are going to come close to agreeing, and patients in general are going to want their care closest to home, want it done in the best fashion possible with the most up-to-date treatment, but also where they've got the love and support of family and friends, certainly much easier socioeconomically to be treated close to home.
Yeah, I tell patients that they can usually expect one of two outcomes from a second opinion, either reassurance with what your initial treatment plan has been, or you may learn something that could be useful at this point in your care or somewhere down the road.
Exactly.
Now, one thing I think that confuses patients is there's several phases of clinical trials. You hear about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 clinical trials. Could you sort of concisely walk us through the difference between a phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trial?
So a phase 1 trial is essentially for patients whose tumors have not responded to standard therapy. So these patients have been through traditional treatment and their tumors haven't shrunk or gone away. So their doctor considers them as an appropriate candidate, and they're motivated to look at additional treatment. So these are brand new drugs, different mechanisms of killing cancer cells, and the purpose of the trial is to really look at what's the safest route and what's the most efficacious route to give the drug. So looking at the safety and the scheduling of the agent. But in all these trials, the bottom line is, can we make patients' tumors shrink? Can we make patients live longer with a better quality of life? Once a drug is determined to be safe and we have a good idea of the schedule in which it should be given, then the drug moves into a phase 2 trial. And this tends to be a much more uniform group of patients. A phase 2 trial will be 40 to 60 patients, all with the same type of breast cancer, all the same type of colon cancer or lung cancer, based on where we think the drug might work. And then if the drug looks sufficiently active, if we see a certain number of tumors shrink, if we get a feeling that the drug might work, then the drug moves into phase 3 studies. And phase 3 studies are when you begin to add these drugs to standard of care regimens. So you've got a good standard of care therapy, and then half the patients will get the new drug in addition, and half the patients will just get the standard of care treatment. And the comparison in that phase 3 trial is what usually leads to FDA approval and the drugs becoming available to patients throughout the country.
So the phase 3 trial is really where the patient is getting randomized. Right, and that's something that concerns patients.
It does concern patients. It's interesting when you start to think about it and you think phase 1, really early, really new, do I want to participate? But as you suggest, in a phase 1 trial, everybody's getting the study medication. So there's no randomization, there's no placebo, everybody gets the real drug. When we go to phase 2, it tends to be the same thing. Now it's a much more uniform group of patients, but everybody's getting the drug, and everybody's getting it on the same schedule, and the patients look much more similar. Phase 3 means that the drug has looked active enough and has looked safe enough that now we want to see if it'll add to or be better than standard of care. So now the drug's been through 4 or 5 years of clinical development, but now becomes the part that you can get a little scary with. You might not get the new therapy in the randomization, often left up to a computer. So, and that's the place where sometimes a placebo comes into play. So a sugar pill or a dummy injection, and that's a situation where you just have to remember everybody's getting standard of care. This is what you would have gotten off trial, and then half the patients are going to get the new medicine and half the patients are not.
One question I often get is, in a phase 3 trial, well, why can't I just get the experimental treatment? Why do I have to participate in a phase 3 trial?
And I think that we've learned through the years that sometimes we get surprised in a phase 3 trial. So we've done the best work we can in phase 1, 2 to decide what's the best dose, what's the best schedule for the drug to be delivered on, and how we should give it to patients. And then we get an idea of how well it works. And then we go to a phase 3 trial where now hundreds or maybe even thousands of patients will be treated. And when we look at it, and you looked at a body of 1,000 patients, you might find out that 4 or 5% of the time you're having a side effect that isn't seen in the other group. So relatively low percentages of events, but enough that it might be a concern once these drugs are out there. You have to remember, for example, that you're going to have almost 200,000 women diagnosed with breast cancer in the United States this year. So when a new therapy comes out for breast cancer, the numbers aren't going to affect 40 patients or 60 patients like the phase 2 trial. It's going to affect thousands of patients. And it's only in those larger trials where we really see the relative benefits and the relative risks for taking the new therapy.
I want to finish up here with one final question, and that is, if you were hypothetically talking to a new patient and wanted to advise them about how to think about clinical trials, what would your advice be?
So my advice for a patient looking at a clinical trial is to get all the information they can. I try to explain to them what the rationale is behind the new therapy, why we might be looking at this drug, why we might be looking at this new type of treatment approach. And then I have the nurses go through it with them in great detail. Look at the consent form and really discuss what the potential side effects might be and what the potential additional burdens will be for participating in the study, extra clinic visits or extra tests that are participated. But I really encourage the patient to strongly consider it. I do believe that this is the way forward to help not only themselves but other patients. The idea that you're going to have the extra set of eyes, that you've got extra staff participating in your care can only be beneficial for the patient. And we tend to find out sooner if there's good news or bad news, and we tend to find out about test results in such a way that we can really help the patient's overall cancer treatment.
Is there anyone that shouldn't consider participating in a clinical trial?
I think that, and that's where family members can help out. I think really if you're in a situation where the patient's in a socioeconomic situation where getting back and forth to the clinic for maybe additional tests or additional visits, that might be a concern. Patients that have comorbid conditions, so I'm talking about patients with other medical problems where they're taking other medicines for diabetes or heart disease. I think they need to be very honest with their physician about what's going on with their other medical problems. And in those scenarios, sometimes that's a situation where the burden for the patient might be a little bit more than they can handle. But I think in general, the vast majority of patients should really strongly consider talking to their doctor about it and participating if an appropriate trial is available.
Okay. Well, Skip, thank you for your time today, and we really look forward to having you back.
Thank you.